Good evening, everyone, and today I want to talk about something that I feel Bandai has been underselling a bit because they were too busy talking about the Gundam Metaverse and the NFTs that they're planning to implement into it. And that thing is the Gunpla VR, or as they also call it, Road to Gunpla Battle Volume 3. So, to quickly recap, the two tests that we've had before this, or Volume 1 and 2, so to say, were very separate and also used like very different technologies to the point that I wondered if the two were even really all that connected at all, or if they would be connected somehow in the future. So the first test was with a large and heavy custom-made scanning machine that could only, or that they would only let scan a handful of Gunpla, but it was able to do it really well, and they were then imported into a very basic game. Basic, but fun. The big problem though was that in order to achieve this accuracy, the Gunpla that would be used still needed to be calibrated by the staff, so it wasn't simply plug and play or scan and play. And on top of that, because it used a giant proprietary scanning machine, you're never gonna get something like this for home use. Like, even for use in an arcade, it's gonna be difficult, I believe. The second test then utilized your smartphone, so much more achievable. But instead of a game, your scanned Gunpla would now be featured in a pre-rendered movie. And of course, because they used a few smartphone pictures versus the I don't know how many pictures they took with the dedicated scanning machine, the things you could do with this scanned Gunpla were very much limited. There is no movement whatsoever. Well, there's no movement from the Gunpla itself, and the scanning results also varied drastically from Gunpla to Gunpla. Some were almost perfect, some were a complete disaster, and most were somewhere in between. Like, you would especially notice that the machine had like an issue detecting gaps in mobile suits, or like detecting where the mobile suit stopped and where the background began. But still, it was an impressive feat and something that could actually be perfected for home use. And this then brings us to the third round of testing, Gunpla Battle VR, which will be held in October from the 6th to the 9th in Japan. And even though we, and many Japanese for that matter, won't be able to participate, it is still a really cool thing to see. And the reason why many people won't be able to experience this is because you needed to enter a lottery system to participate, because per person they estimate around 15 minutes. Basically, this third round of testing seems like a bit of a hybrid of the first two tests. First, you get 2 minutes to set up your Gunpla inside of the big scanner thing to scan it. So, just like the first round. But like the second round, you can now bring whatever Gunpla you want as long as it fits within the regulations, which we'll go over in a second. And on top of scanning your Gunpla, you now also get to scan two functional handheld weapons for your Gunpla to wield, a rifle and a melee weapon. In the second test, there were no functional weapons because, well, it was just a movie, and in the first test, only the Gundam itself was scanned, with the beam rifle and the beam saber that you could use already existing in the game. But they estimate that this scanning will take about 5 minutes, and then with the remaining time, you get to put on those VR glasses and experience your Gunpla in two ways. You can float around the hangar and admire your Gunpla, and then you get to launch in it and fight against the big Zam. But I do have two big questions here, with the most important one being, is there going to be a toggle or something for your viewpoint? Because almost all of the footage shows you piloting your Gunpla in third person. But there is also one shot that shows us inside of the cockpit. So is this cockpit view playable, or is it just going to be part of the flying around the hangar and admire your Gunpla experience? Like, you can enter the cockpit and experience what it would be like, but as soon as you get into battle, it switches to third person. And while I can understand why Bandai would want to push the third person view, because, I mean, then you see the entire Gunpla, which is kind of the point of this test, I do still feel like the cockpit view would offer us the most authentic experience. And then my second question is, you can scan in a Gunpla and 2 weapons, but in this image, they show that it seems like your shield, if you have one, is going to be held in the hangar as well. So is the system going to try to determine what your shield is? Or more likely, did they forget to tell the artist that the shield scanning isn't going to be part of this test yet and will only be implemented at a later date? How the whole thing looks then is fortunately much closer to the first test than the second test. Or at least until it starts moving. Remember how I said that in the first test they spent a relatively large amount of time on like tweaking the scanned Gunpla? Well, I think that in this test they're trying to make everything go as automatic as possible. So the fluidity of the movement was definitely impacted. Like, they are rather static, and especially in this fragment, there's some weird jerkiness going on. Or in this fragment with the SD Gundam, there's hardly any movement at all. But credit where credit is due, if this has all become more or less automated, this is definitely a great step in the right direction for creating actual Gunpla battle. But of course, there are also quite some rules as to which Gunpla and weapons you can and cannot scan. And yes, that includes the rules you're thinking about. So the most important thing is the size of both your Gunpla and its weapons. Your machine can be 15 centimeters tall, 15 centimeters wide, and 10 centimeters deep. So about 6 by 6 by 4 inches. Meaning that most 1/144th scale Gunpla will fit. Keep your Neo Zeons at home. And even though they do just write 1/144th scale kits like the high grade, real grade, and entry grade, I'm also pretty sure this means you can use some of the old 1/100 scale F91 and Victory Gundam kits, especially if you're gonna go with the gun tank. SD Gundams can also be scanned, but only those using the cross silhouette frame. And I'm fairly certain that this is because it is like one of the only SD Gunpla lines that has actual joints. There is no mention about the master grade SDs though, because I think they would actually fit within that 15 by 15 by 10 centimeter like dimension thing, and they also have plenty of movable joints. Also then, in order to be scanned, your Gunpla needs to have either a standard 3mm hole in its butt, or be compatible with the 6 or 7mm claw connectors. And it of course must also be strong enough to withstand some small vibrations, so make sure your Gunpla is well put together, because, I mean, you don't want the thing moving around while it's being scanned. For the weapons then, things are a lot more stringent, and actually a lot of weapons are straight up eliminated because of these rules. So, the height of the weapon can be 5 centimeters, 2 inches, including the handle. It can be 2 centimeters wide, 12.8 inches, and the maximum length is 15 centimeters or 6 inches, with some slightly different specifics for the guns and the melee weapons. For the guns, from the barrel to the handle can be 10 centimeters long, 4 inches, meaning that longer sniper rifles are a no-go, and from the handle to the butt can be 5 centimeters or 2 inches, meaning that bazookas are out as well. And then for melee weapons, the blade can be 12.5 centimeters, 5 inches, and the handle 2.5 centimeters, 1 inch, eliminating any kind of spear or pole arm. Basically, your choice of weaponry is limited to standard-sized beam rifles, machine guns, swords, and axes. A decision that I think they made to minimize clipping issues. Another restriction, though, has to do with how the weapon is scanned. Because it's now scanned individually, there's a clip that has to clamp onto the handle while it's being scanned. So there can't be anything in the way that would prevent that clip from gripping the weapon, well, from gripping the handle from the bottom up. So even if it could be clipped from the back, it is still a no-go. The weapon has to fit in this structure while being clipped. And then the final technical rules are that the Gunpla must have movable joints, so it can be posed for the scanning, and it is prohibited to enter kits with clear parts, plated parts, or parts that have been painted with metallic or candy paints, because then the machine might not be able to accurately scan them. But for some reason, it looks like they are actually using a clear Gunpla themselves in the promotional video, so do as I say, not as I do. And of course, finally, we also have some rules concerning to what you can bring for other reasons. Only genuine Gunpla are allowed, but you can use other materials that have been sufficiently modified so that they no longer resemble the original. So how I see it is, for example, you can't use a weapon from like Kotobukiya's modeling support goods as a straight build, but you can use it if you combine it with like an existing Gunpla weapon. Next up, no other IPs may be used, so no cosplay builds. And finally, works that violate public order and morals are prohibited. But this does have me wondering, how far does it go? Because this is an extremely vague guideline, and I'm sure that some of Bandai's existing models also go against the morals of some people. So part of me wouldn't be surprised if someone were to test out the limits of this policy with either a Super Fumina custom or a Loheng Rinko custom. And that is the current state of real-life Gunpla battle. It is still far from complete, but I am definitely impressed by the progress that they've made. The question now is, where do we go from here, and is this test representative of what we can expect in the future? Because part of me is afraid that this test has also shown us some of the technical limitations of adapting a 3D scanned Gunpla to a movable and playable object in-game. Taking into account that it seems like Bandai wants this system to be very streamlined. Think, for example, fully movable and functional backpacks. Things like the Tall Geese's boosters or the Freedom Gundam's wings. I can think of ways to make it possible with like multiple scans and a lot of manual adjustments, but with just one single scan and an automated system to import the model into the game, this is just impossible. And the same goes for built-in weaponry. Without manual adjustment, this is even more impossible. So I wouldn't be surprised that even in the future, weaponry is always going to be limited to handheld weapons that have to be scanned separately. And the final big question then is, the end goal for Bandai is obviously going to be some kind of commercial product, and ideally something they can put into the metaverse. But while the second testing phase has shown us that 3D scanning with smartphones can be impressive, it is nowhere near the level required for IRL Gunpla battle at this moment. The final big question then has to do with Bandai's end goal. Now, it is obviously going to be some kind of commercial product, preferably something they could put inside of the metaverse, but what exactly is going to be feasible here? While the second testing phase has shown us that 3D scanning with smartphones can be impressive, it is still nowhere near the level required for IRL Gunpla at the moment. Well, IRL Gunpla battle at the moment. So are they going to be able to push this technology even further, which I don't think is going to be possible? Or are they going to settle for like an elaborate arcade machine with a cheaper version of that like proprietary Gunpla scanner thing they have at the moment? Because do remember, arcades are still very popular in Japan, and there are some really elaborate arcade machines out there. Think, for example, the pods from Bonds of the Battlefield 2. Whatever the case might end up being, though, I don't think IRL Gunpla Battle is ever going to be perfect, but I do think that at their current pace, they will exceed the expectations I had for it. But let me know what you think down below. How is it looking so far, and where do you think they're going to be able to go from here? And that has been all for this video on the third test of the Road to Gunpla battle. As always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great evening, and I'll see you all next time.